Okay, so today's session will be focusing specifically on the 2020 paper, okay, but at the same time, I also want to go through the other papers because I think it's been a long time since we actually sort of did source-based question and everything. So I wanted everyone to at least not only recap, but also remember how to specifically answer some of these questions. Okay, so the 2020 paper, um, it was not hard, but the problem with the 2020 paper was specifically because of the topic itself, because of the, I would say, the theme itself that was a little bit different from the other years. I think that was the one that a lot of the students actually had issues, or the students actually were afraid of. Okay, the topic itself was a bit hard. I think those were the ones that I think um, um, be careful about it. Okay, because they can ask you on anything, and hence you just have to be prepared. Okay, now even if they throw you questions or topics that is like, I don't get it, or it seems very not familiar, it's not something that we have gone through, read the sources very carefully. Okay, unlike in history, social studies is something that all the answers are there. All right. Okay, so let's take a look at question 1 specifically. It is a message question. So it is 5 marks. So don't waste time with this. Okay. I always have a feeling that a lot of students tend to waste time with message question, when in fact, message questions specifically is just basically, what is the message? Okay. The most important thing is it is the message statement that you need to have. Agree? Okay. Now, besides the message statement that we are talking about, it is about the source. And then later on, you'll see that, what if, let's say, I only identify one aspect of the source? I think this is the one that you have to be just very careful about. Okay. Now, look at question 2. It is about compare contrast. Okay. Agree. Again, the keyword here is, would the author of source B agree with the cartoonist in source C? So the first 10 minutes of your source-based question, the first 10 minutes of your paper, remember I was telling you, open it up, just look at it, annotate it, make sure that you are able to identify the keywords. So specifically for this question, the keyword is author, the perspective of the author, correct, the point of view of the author, and what the cartoonist is saying. So it is a bit tricky because we are looking at specifically cartoonists, we are looking at point of view of the author, so it is slightly demanding. Okay, so you have to be very, very, very careful about that. All right, now the other aspect is, of course, when you talk about agree, you must answer the question. Okay, even though yes, we acknowledge that agree actually means similar, and disagree actually means difference, never answer this. They never ask you about similarity, or they never ask you specifically about difference. They are asking you agree and disagree. So you must use the keywords of the question. Okay, because if not, it will be penalized. So if you had seen all the PDF that I've sent you, there are also snapshots for every year, snapshots of Marcus report, and I'll go through slightly about the Marcus report, what Cambridge Marcus or what SAB is looking for. Okay, so for question 3, it is again utility. How useful is this source? Again, you must be very careful about utility. Useful about what? Useful about the arguments for introducing a minimum wage. So when we say that introducing a minimum wage, what does it mean? So this whole entire source base is about minimum wage. But again, it is about arguments. So that means there are different perspective, different point of view. So you must be careful. So these are small little, again, annotations that you do to make sure that even before you are doing the source-based question itself, you are prepared. Okay. Now let's take a look at question 4. It is surprise, which is very easy. Okay, there must be an element of surprise when you compare source E and F. Okay, so remember the first paragraph, I am surprised because when I cross-reference to source E says something, it is different from source F. correct? Okay, the second paragraph, it is not surprising. And in here, you'll be saying that it actually not surprised. It can be cross-reference to other sources. And you will also see that the cross-reference, it may not be cross-reference, okay? It could be looking at purpose, looking at context, or even looking at the provenance itself. So this is a very important question later that we will go through. Okay, now moving on, of course, this is it. So don't be afraid, don't be afraid, because they can always ask you on anything. But the most important thing that I want you to focus on is what kind of question is this? Is it an agency question? Is it a reason question? And obviously, this is a reason question. Why? Because they're asking you, does the minimum wage law do more harm than good? That means you need to find, yes, it does more harm, or is it no, it is actually beneficial? Okay. And if it is beneficial, how? If it is harmful, how? The so what? All right, this is the link. Okay, so let's go through now the background information. So you can see, right, this one, question 5, actually asks you minimum wage laws do more harm than good. But you always see that the big question is always very different. It's always to sort of give you that big overview. Okay, what impact do minimum wage laws have on workers? So they ask about impact, right? Agree? They ask about impact. But when they ask about impact, the impact means that it is either harmful or it is positive beneficial. So that is why your question 5, as well as the big question of any source-based question, it matches. It does match. So it helps you, it guides you. So that's why you must do a fast, a very quick, let's read at all the sources. Okay. What was interesting, what I really liked about the 2020 paper was that the background information was so little. Okay, it's a hit and miss. That means it's so little in comparison later on. Remember, if when we recap, when we do 2017, 2018, 2019, it was so long, especially 2017. But 2020 was just right. So does it mean that it is useless because it's a very short background information? Okay, let's take a look at this. Many countries have introduced laws to control the minimum wage, which can be paid to workers. Okay, minimum wage are set. So what is minimum wage? So if, let's say, for example, it is something which it is very different, it is something that you are not familiar with, the background information will give you enough information. So don't panic. Don't panic when you see things that is very unfamiliar. Don't panic. I think you guys have said for all the papers, being in the hall and everything, sometimes the energy and the anxiety is very, very high, but focus. You only have 1 hour and 45 minutes this time. Okay. So it says here that minimum wage rates are set so that it is illegal to pay workers below a certain amount per hour. That means is the simple definition is I must make sure that people are paid reasonably. Okay, reasonable. Because why? Because unfortunately there are people who are not paid a certain amount. Okay, you cannot pay someone just 50 cents for an entire day. There must be a minimum wage. So that means it can be like, oh, the minimum wage of a person, example okay, who cleans the dishes must be $6.50 per hour. You cannot pay that person less because it doesn't make sense. It's someone's labor, someone's hard work. All right. But remember when I tell you that every time you have to look at the word however, okay, so the however always changes the narrative of the background information. However, there are difference of opinions about the benefits and drawbacks. Drawbacks is the negative aspects, okay? Supporters who says that must be this law says that it provides workers with a better standard of living, while opponents says that it will cause people to lose jobs. Then the question is, isn't it good to actually have basic salary, right? It's basic salary. Everyone is basic salary. Why is it so bad? Because there are problems with basic salary. If it is very expensive to pay someone to do very manual labor, companies are not going to hire. Companies are going to find always alternatives. Who are the alternatives? Foreign workers, or maybe they find illegal workers who's willing to pay or who's willing to be paid at very low. So these are pros and cons. So this entire source-based question is really about the pros and cons. Okay. All right. Let's look at source A now. If you look at source A, it is a cartoon, and you all know about cartoons and how sometimes you're very, very worried about cartoons, right? Cartoons are the killer sometimes, okay? So if you look very carefully at this, it says here there are two different bubbles. So be very careful in the O level. If there is, okay, two different bubbles, most of the time, it is two different points of view. Do you need to have two different points of view? Do you need to have two inference? Because at the end of the day, this particular thing is messaged, okay? And specifically, when I talk about messaged, it is really about what the cartoonist is trying to tell you. Okay, the cartoonist is trying to convince, the cartoonist is trying to condemn, the cartoonist is trying to persuade. What is the cartoonist trying to do? So if you look very carefully, and if you look at the newspaper, the newspaper there, minimum wage debate. So there is a debate. So who are these people in this big so fast? They are people who are basically the higher SES, correct? The rich people, all right? The people with the money. And they say that, oh, when you raise the minimum wage, people will lose jobs. Such an irony, right? Okay. Whereas the butler here, or the worker, whoever it is, oh, you're right, I would finally be able to quit my two other jobs, which means that he in this particular scenario, working in this kind of environment, he's not able to have, for example, fair wage. Can't you know? Because why? He has to work two other jobs. So the cartoonist is being very critical of this, or is the cartoonist being supportive of this? So be very careful, because first questions will make most of the candidates wobble, because it's usually a cartoon, it's usually something that will make a student sort of like waste time. It's right there, but they overthink. So don't overthink. Message questions, you only will have 10 minutes max. Okay, so let's take a look. How do you answer it? It's just this. It's literally just this, that it is to convince the people, it is convinced the American public that actually it's pros and cons. It has the advantages, it has the disadvantages. Going back, correct or not? You can see that there are advantages, which is this one. You can also see that there are negative aspects. So be very careful. So the message is, because this is by an American magazine. Now this is a message. Message means you must have one, the message statement, correct? You must have two, the American public. That means what is American public? You identify audience. Message, purpose, must identify audience. This is not an inference question. Now, when you have an American, don't write, please don't write, oh, it is to convince people. Because you already have a certain audience, write down the audience. Be very succinct and be very careful about your answers, okay? So it shows that minimum wage can increase the worker's salary, but also reduce the jobs, impacting the workers. Okay. However, the butler thinks that it will have a positive impact. He doesn't have to take 3 jobs just to earn a decent living. And this suggests that minimum wage has pros and cons, and it is hard to come to a consensus, and there is a need to improve on it. And this is it. This is basically it. No need to think so hard. Okay, so what did the Marcus report say? The Marcus report said that in 2020, this question was actually answered very, very well. So don't worry. Okay, candidates were able to see beyond literal interpretations. Of course, a lot of them focus on the positive outcome and argue that they don't have to hold this, which is correct. So if you had actually identified and you have actually seen, oh, it's very positive, you are right. You are okay. All right. Other candidates saw that the cartoonists wanted to convey that there are different opinions. So this is the better answer, differing opinions. Okay, there is negative and there's positive. And some says that it is the debate is something that is difficult. Now, how did the Marcus report identify debate? You look at the cartoon. A debate means there are pros and cons. So be very careful when you look at cartoons. Be very mindful of everything that they give you, every single detail. Okay? All right. So don't worry. It is a very well answered question. So that means assure yourself that in the event of O levels, okay, they have a cartoon. So cartoons are usually the easier ones, okay? The 5 marks questions are easier. The first question should be an easy one. So don't overthink. Follow your natural instinct, how you react to the source, and write. Okay? Can I? All right, now let's take a look at source B as well as source C. Okay, now source B and source C is actually about compare contrast. Okay, so when we talked about compare and contrast, specifically when we look at source B as well as source C, okay, it does talk about the agreement between these two sources. Okay, agreement between these two sources. So in any compare and contrast question, you obviously need to compare. Agree? So when you compare and contrast specifically, what are the criteria that you are looking at? What aspects of these things do they agree or disagree? Again, because the question is agree and because the question is disagree, you must use agree and disagree. Keywords. Do not use similarity, do not use differences. Okay? So let's look at source B intentionally. What are the things, what are the keywords? Okay? So it is written by a blog by an Irish worker commenting on low minimum wages in Ireland. And it says here, it is good. It is good at creating jobs as it allows more people to be employed. Okay. However, other commentators call them poverty wages. Okay, why poverty wages? Okay, what is this poverty? Poverty, isn't poverty associated with poor? All right. So how can minimum wage, which is the basic pay that any employers give you to have a decent living, how is it poverty? How is it not enough? Okay. So what is the point of poverty wage if it's not enough to earn, to be spent or saved in the economy? The harmful impact is that it is not restricted to those who earn them. Taxpayers, and you can see taxpayers have to pay for more welfare allowance, and this takes money from other public services. Trade unions have called for the minimum wage to be raised significantly. What is the point of having low minimum wage except to make extra profit for companies that employ people? At the end of the day, a minimum wage worker is making massive profits for the employer at the expense of his own well-being. So sensing is negative, isn't it? Sensing that it is actually, yes, it is positive here, but all this is actually negative. So this guy, this Irish shop worker is saying that basically it is, there is a positive aspect. The positive aspects is that it creates more jobs. Okay, that means there is this possibility of having jobs, but at the same time, there is a lot more negativity to this particular law, this particular minimum wage law. A minimum wage law, for those of you who just came in, is really about making sure that by law, people need to pay a person a certain amount of salary that is decent, okay, so that they can actually have a living. I think that is the meaning of the basic minimum of minimum wage law. So here you can sense there's positive, yes, create jobs, but there's also a lot of negative. And then let's look at source C. Source C is by, again, a British organization which campaigns to improve workers' rights. This one is just basically an Irish worker. It means just a normal shop owner. Okay. But if you look very carefully here, at the same time, it says here, poverty, keep working is the only way out. And you can see that even if you have a minimum wage, even if the people who employs you actually pay you a minimum wage, is the minimum wage enough? It's not. It is not enough. And because it is not enough, they are still stuck in poverty. So can you sense now the similarities or the agreement that actually both sources, if you look very carefully, if you zoom out, remember when I keep on saying about zoom in, zoom out? So when you zoom out at both these two sources, as you're making that connection next Monday, if let's say you have a compare contrast question, you zoom out lah. And then you zoom out, you say like, yeah, both of them are saying keywords, both of them are saying poverty. If you look very carefully, look at the keyword here, it says poverty. And then look at the keyword here, is there poverty here? So remember when I talk about compare and contrast or agree and disagree, is about the keyword. So it does tell you that at the end of it, that the author of Source B agrees with the cartoonist that it doesn't improve the standard of living. It doesn't improve because people have to work at the expense of their health, correct? Because they just keep on working, but they never meet that target, or they never make enough money to sustain their lifestyle. Okay, and if you look at Source C, it shows that you do not get out specifically of this low wage or low income. Okay, in fact, you keep on digging and digging and digging, and you will not get out of it, as seen from Source C. Okay, so both of them agree, the author agrees, because both of them shows that there is just no improvement in standard of living. Okay, all right, so let's take a look at what then is the similarities. Okay, so let's see. Now, who specifically benefits from this? Actually, it is the companies and it is the rich people that specifically benefits. Can you see this part? Okay, this part here. This part, okay. So they are the ones that benefit. And then if you look very carefully, okay, a cartoon, workers improve rights. This person here, okay, keep working is the only way out. You do not know whether this person here is a rich person. You do not know whether this person here symbolizes the entire society. And this person, or is this person being sarcastic, right? Keep working is the only way out. For all you know, this person is saying that keep working is the only way out. It is advised. Correct? There's nothing, nothing says. It just says that it improves an organization with campaigns to improve workers' rights. Correct? So this is the tricky one. All right. So because you don't know whether this person is being sarcastic or not sarcastic, so let's take a look at the answer. Now, the author of Source B disagree with the cartoonist in Source C because we do not know whether society benefits from minimum wage. Now, in Source B is a clear-cut don't benefit. Because don't benefit why? Because even if, let's say, you have a minimum wage, there are so many things that people need to do. They still need to pay and provide welfare allowances. Now, what is the meaning of welfare allowances? Welfare allowances is given specifically by the government. It is given by the government, okay? And the reason why it is given by the government is because people don't earn enough. They just don't earn enough. And because they don't earn enough, the government needs to step in. So because the government then uses their money, right, to pay for these workers who really cannot make their ends meet, that means it is at the expense of other things. That is what he was saying. Okay. So whereas this one, because we are not so sure whether this is an advice or this person is being sarcastic, all right, there is a difference. So Source B clearly shows that society do not benefit. Okay, while Source C states that society do benefit. Agree? And specifically in Source C, it shows the richer people in society or society itself standing on top of the whole, asking the workers to keep working. So it shows that the society does benefit from the workers' hard work because he is continuing to dig the hole. Not easy to get this. Okay, not easy to get this. All right, I'm going to show you the Marcus report. Okay, so is there a purpose to this agree, compare, contrast, agree or disagree question? Okay, the highest marks actually went to this. Both sources agree to the intent that minimum wage needs to be increased for the workers and countries. There was no purpose, but it was just an agreement in intent. Now, what does an agreement in intent means? It is just the outcome. No purpose, no nothing. An agreement in the impact is actually just outcome. There wasn't even a purpose. You can see this. The answer didn't even talk about purpose. So take a look at the Marcus report. Again, a lot of people answered this very well, even though it was quite tricky. I found it a bit tricky. Okay, it says that there was a lot of comparison. Many candidates saw that both sources actually showed that the minimum wage has caused hardship at the expense of their well-being, which is what we've seen, right? Which is the most obvious. So many candidates also saw that the two sources would disagree on who would suffer as a result of not increasing the minimum wage. Source B okay, discussed that the impact on workers and taxpayers, while source C focuses mainly on workers, which means that in source B, the difference is the impact is on workers and taxpayers, whereas source C is really about the workers, right? Because the workers only seems to benefit the richer and the society itself, okay? The more discerning candidates thought about the possible outcome that both sources aim to achieve, such as the call to rethink the issue, that how minimum wage will actually benefit the workers. Okay, meaning this. That means both sources actually agree that the government or whoever is doing the minimum wage must be very careful and must work to increase the this law such that everyone will benefit. So that is one part of it. Now, weaker candidates studied the similarity or differences, but didn't answer the question on agree or disagree. So this is what I was telling you. Okay, all right. Now, moving on to question D. Question D is a utility question. You would need to read other sources as well, okay? All right, so I will later on toggle between other sources, okay? So again, this is not highly recommended to go from one question to one question to one question. When you do source-based question, what is the first trick? The first trick is to read all the sources again, and then you look at the how each source actually connects, okay? So this question is on utility, and when we talk about utility, most important is your hence source is reliable, thus useful. Always go for R first. Sorry, can't see. Always go for reliable first and then useful. Can? Okay, now let's take a look. So this is by a former chief executive of the Singapore government. He was, sorry, a professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Now, a minimum wage is needed to help bring our working poor up to a decent standard of living. It is high time. So Singapore doesn't have a minimum wage. Okay, Singapore at this time when they did the source, they didn't have a minimum wage. Of course, now Singapore government has adopted a minimum wage for the lower income family or the lower SES families. That means there is a certain amount of money that employers need to pay workers. Okay. Now, in countries where a minimum wage works best, there is a strong and responsible bargaining between workers and employers. That means when they say this, they're talking about between trade unions. They talk about trade unions and workers. Trade unions, what is the job of trade unions? Trade unions is protecting workers' rights. Okay, they do that. All right, but in Singapore, we have the National Wage Council. Even our trade unions since the 1950s, okay, has been working very, very closely with the government. Okay, and on top of that, if you look very carefully, if the companies cannot fulfill a decent wage, okay, the difference can be topped up by workfare. Remember, we talked about workfare before. We've seen some of the posters about workfare, and workfare is like an added incentive that actually helps the lower paid workers to at least have a bit more subsidies on certain months or on certain periods of the year, at least to sustain their standard of living. Okay, to do that, we need to measure what is required for a minimum wage properly and give out adequate payouts in cash, neither of which we do adequately today, even though we can afford to. So despite him working for the Singapore government, specifically, you can see that he's quite critical in his comments. Okay, and then he says that only then we can begin to make poverty a thing in the past of Singapore. There are still people who are not able to afford certain things, or their standard of living is very, very low. The other thing is they talk about social media posts. Now, is social media specifically reliable? Okay, because this is a utility question, correct? Okay, so first things first, let's look at the question. The question is asking about arguments for introducing a minimum wage. So does he argue that you need a minimum wage? Yes, you need. You need a minimum wage because why? I'm going to highlight in yellow. You need a minimum wage because it is to have a decent standard of living. Basic human need a decent standard of living. So it is useful. So his argument, yes, his argument is extremely useful because why? You need basic what? So useful what? So if it is useful and minimum wage law, that means the government needs to start having this law that will enforce and get companies to pay minimum amount of wage for everyone, a decent amount of pay, then you must cross-reference to also show that it is about decent standard of living, because that is the key and that is the highlight. You need the minimum wage law because it is about standard of living. It is about a decent standard of living. Because the rest of the paragraph, if you look at starting from here to here, it doesn't really tell you anything um, about why it is useful. It just tells you about how to do it. Agree? All right. So only this part. So this one doesn't tell you about that. Only this part, the one in yellow, tells you that why the argument is needed, why we need this minimum wage law. Okay, so it is useful because it states that a minimum wage is to improve the standard of living. That's what I said. This part, standard of living. Okay, and of course, this is a utility question, right? So a utility question, what do you need? You need to answer the question. You need, of course, your source details. You need here, blah, blah, blah. What is this? This is cross-reference to something. So as you are looking at all the sources, because we are accelerating here, we look at background information. Okay, now what is another thing that is key is the question is about for introducing a minimum wage in Singapore. So another thing is your cross-reference. You must make sure that it is about Singapore, because as you can see, you can't cross-reference to source A. If I were to scroll up, you can't reference to source A because source A is in America. You can't also cross-reference to specifically source B, even though it talks about being employed, blah, blah, blah. It's about in Ireland. The question asks you specifically about Singapore. So why do I choose background information? Because background information is generic, correct? And it says here that it is supported by background information because it states that higher wages will provide a better standard of living. Okay, and where is it? It is exactly this part. Correct? So it does link back and it does cross-reference back to here, decent standard of living. Can you see that? Okay, so always go for the keywords. Always go for the keywords when you are doing cross-reference. And always remember, because this is utility question, hence it is reliable, thus it is useful, as it is useful. Okay, now next is this is useful due to cross-reference, right? How about useful due to provenance? Okay, because this guy is a former chief executive of the blah 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 investment corporation. Okay, there were students in the O level that said because he's this, right, not useful. Because why? Oh, he's going to be pro-government. He's going to be very supportive of the government, blah, blah, blah. But remember when we unpacked this particular source, we said that, it actually not what he was quite critical. In fact, he was for the minimum wage law, and that was something that he was actually trying very, very hard to specifically do. So be very careful about that. Just because something is a social media post and just because it is by a person, yes, you can question the reliability. But because he was a chief executive, his rank, his context, his experience matter. And one of the highest level of this particular paper, okay, I hope you can still see the screen, right? Okay, is that it is useful as it is the former chief executive of the Singapore Government Investment, and it was his position. And highest level of utility went to here. And you can see with his expertise in economics and finance, his position, he is suggesting an effective implementation of minimum wage that will bring the low wage workers out of poverty. That's it. That was one of the highest level. You could actually get 7 marks for being able to succinctly and sort of write this. So always look at provenance, okay? And then if you look very carefully, this is the Marcus report in blue. It says here that stronger responses had good perspective, okay, blah, blah, blah. This part here, okay. Other candidates argued that source D is not reliable, not useful. Okay, so this is the not useful part, which I haven't gone through the cross-reference. Okay, this one. Stronger responses presented, I'm going to highlight in blue here, who was a professor. Because of his wealth of knowledge and experience, many candidates argued that he must have thought through the impact and benefit in this. Now, because he was an expert, he will make sound recommendations, stronger responses, just by acknowledging the provenance. So you have to be sort of very careful, very mindful about this. Be very careful because this is a utility question, and if you're able to see that dimension, wow, you can get marks for this. You don't have to write so much and you don't have to think so hard also. Okay. This is utility, right? So highest level went to utility if you're able to actually look at context and provenance. Now, how about not useful? Okay, so not useful, why? It is not useful because it says that the minimum wage workers need minimum wage to improve their standard of living. And remember when I was telling you that it is about the case study about Singapore. So it has to be a case study about Singapore. And the only thing that is about Singapore, if you look at all the sources, is actually source F. Only source F is contradicted by source F because the professor claims that if there is a minimum wage, there is a decent standard of living. Okay, he argues that. That is his argument because the question is about argument. Sorry, the question is about arguments, correct? So he says, I need this law because it will provide a decent standard of living. However, this source is not useful because when I cross-reference to source F, and if you look very carefully at source F, another person who is very, very important, who is the manpower minister, Mrs. Josephine Teo, actually says she has concerns. What are her concerns? Her concerns is, she says, so sorry, not all employers would want to employ workers at a very expensive rate. So that means even though we say that it's minimum wage, okay, imagine you're not going to pay $5,000 for someone who just cleans the streets. What if that becomes the minimum wage? Example, okay? And because there's this minimum wage, it could lead to lower levels of unemployment. And some of them may even choose to work illegally below the minimum wage. Because why? They just want a job. They are desperate for a job. Okay. And it makes them even more vulnerable. So whatever the professor just now said, it doesn't hold, it doesn't stand. So it is contradicted. Okay. And it is because of their cross-reference like this, hence source D is not reliable and thus not useful. This part. Okay. Now, moving on. Be very careful about this. Okay, that's what I was want to tell you. A lot of students were actually also saying that, remember I was telling you about the source that, okay, because this is a chief executive working for the Singapore government, hence it is not reliable. But be very careful, look at this, okay? It requires a critical analysis, challenging for some candidates. That means they couldn't see it. They say that he was connected to government, it was flawed, no evidence, blah, blah, blah. Okay, wrong. Okay, so just be very careful. But I just wanted to highlight this again. Can you see this? Okay, I hope you can see this. That source D just now, the very fact that he says that, oh, have a minimum wage law, everything will be good. Not necessarily. There could be companies who refuse to pay $800 for a contract worker, $800 for a factory worker, because the minimum wage has always been $600. Why do I want to pay the extra $200? And there are people who are willing to work at even lower than $800. I should hire them. All right. So this is the part where it says not useful about the arguments of minimum wage. Okay, all right, let's move on. Okay, let's look at source E and source F. So source E and source F, again, it is about surprising. Okay, let's take a look at source E and then let's take a look at source F. So just now I've unpacked a little bit about source F. Okay, now source E, it is by a Canadian news site, and quite shocking, it says here that the minimum wage will increase from just $1, you know, $1 only. And because of that, a lot of protests by businesses. $1. Why? Because $1 means if $1 times 1,000, $1 times 20,000, and that's a lot of money for companies, right? But especially if you are a small business, now that is even harder because you have to incur more costs, all right? And it says here that minimum wage rises create more jobs than they remove. And this employment law project confirms that even industries that has very low wage workers, such as retail, hospitality, show employment gains after a minimum wage rise. So that means this particular source is very pro minimum wage, very pro, correct? That means I'm supportive. Supporters of minimum wage rises argue that they are positive for the economy because why? It allows them to go out and spend. That means what? Once I earn money, I will spend because I have the extra money, right? Because now my pay is not that low. My pay is now maybe extra. That $1 means that maybe a whole month it could be an extra 500, a whole month it could be an extra 200. So I get to spend a little bit more. By spending a little bit more, it leads to economic growth. Agree? Now, source E is positive, is pro towards having a law that ensures that employers pay minimum wage. But let's look at source F. Remember source F? We talked about source F, right? So source F doesn't seem to agree that having a minimum wage actually increases the standard of living of people. If you look very carefully, she has this worry. She has a worry. She is worried that just by having this minimum wage law, as I was saying, not all employers want to pay. And the very fact that it will make them vulnerable, it will make them actually have no jobs because no one is going to pay for something that is extra or something that is added. So she says that even though she is manpower minister, okay, she doesn't think that a minimum wage law will help. In fact, as a minister for manpower, she's very worried that people are not going to be employed. Okay, so let's take a look at the answer. Does source E make source F surprising? It is surprising, isn't it? One says very good, and one seems to be anti or against this minimum wage law, which is source F. So it is surprising. Okay. Source E makes source F surprising as source E says that the minimum wage will increase more employment. Correct? Source E says this, but however, source F disagree because it says that some workers are going to be more expensive to employ and hence there will be less employment. So very simple. When you look at the two sources, there is a difference. There's a very clear difference. Okay. Source E doesn't make source F surprising because both of them do agree, okay, that minimum wage will impact workers negatively. It will lead to job losses. Why? Where is that job losses in source E? Remember that Canadian source? The very fact that a lot of them will be forced to cut staff. Can you see the cut staff here? So this is the negative aspect, right? The cut staff, right? And then look at source F. Source F, look at source F. Not many people would want to employ workers. This is again cut staff. Correct? So it shows unemployment. So both of them are not surprising because when we introduce this minimum wage law, there is a possibility that it would lead to job losses. Now, this is a 7 marks question. Give me both sides. At least you would already have a 4 to 5 marks already. So what is the difference? What is the element? What is the extra to get that 6 to 7 marks? Not surprising due to context. There's two. One is not surprising because who the person is, source F. We're talking about source F only, source F. Okay. Source E doesn't make source F surprising as both of them talks about implementation of wage in different countries, correct? One is in Canada, the other one is in Singapore. Of course, they are different. Of course, it is not surprising. Agree? All right. So this is basically the different continents, different countries. Both of them, okay, source E doesn't make source F surprising because both of them talks about the implementation in different countries. Remember this? This is exactly what we talk about when, oh, this is in 2009, that one is in 2003, this one is in 2011, this one is in 2003, the different in time frame. So this is the different in countries. So it is not surprising that they have different point of view. They are from two different countries and the success rate would be different. Okay, agree? And then you look at this. Source E does not make source F surprising because it is the minister. She is in charge of manpower. And when she's in charge of manpower, she wants to highlight the negative impact of the minimum wage. Okay. And I want you guys to see the one, and okay, so anything that is in blue for this particular source-based question, or when I send you the PDF, is actually from the Marcus report. And I want you to look at this very, very carefully. Okay, some candidates, for instance, argue that they're not surprised as the manpower minister is responsible for keeping high unemployment. She was obviously worried about the welfare of the workers. Okay, it is also not surprising that she does not want to be held responsible for the possibility of falling employment rates. Okay, so she's very cautious about the plan. So look at the responses. These responses based on different cross-references routes or routes, different contexts, critical analysis of source F. Can you see? Three ways of doing this. Cross-reference, you can test it based on cross-reference. You can test it based on difference in context. You can also test it by looking at critical analysis. That means it is not surprised because of cross-reference. It is not surprising because of context. And when I talk about context, I'm talking about different countries. It is not surprising because of how source F is. Correct? And we're talking about the provenance of source F. So can you see that? Can you see that there are many ways? So don't worry if you cannot do everything. And none of it, if you look very carefully, is really about purpose. So look at the source and what is most comfortable, what is most obvious to you, then that will be your not surprising part. Okay? All right. Now, moving on, okay, we take a look at taking perspective. And taking perspective, again, always unpack, always unpack, always unpack. That means as you are reading all the sources at the back of your mind, unpack, unpack, unpack. Minimum wage laws do more harm than good. And it is very, very obvious that it does, okay? The only trend that I've seen, and we've talked about it when we did the N-level paper last week, that there could be sources that will say yes, and there'll be sources that say no. In fact, I've done all the answers for you guys to take a look, okay? But I wanted you, if you are looking at the PDF itself, you can actually scroll all the way at the back here. And if you look very carefully, it actually does tell you that it is both a yes, it is both a no. That means sources can actually lend itself to a yes and no. Possible, yes and no. So what will you do then? Okay, so the most important thing is what is the source detail or what is the thing that you have identified? Okay, so for example, when we look at source A, Okay, I look at source A specifically, point in reference. Remember we talked about source A? We said that for this particular question, okay, it is both a yes and no. It does harm. That means there are people who is going to lose their jobs. There are also people who is going to benefit because they are able now to earn a decent living without sacrificing their time, their effort. You know, they don't have to be so tired to get so many jobs, because now at least it is a decent pay. So it's a yes and no, isn't it? All right. So because it is a yes and no, okay, I agree. Always remember how you answer the question. I know, I don't know whether some of you in the prelim, if you guys remembered, it is not about source agrees or source disagree. It is I agree. How far do you agree? I agree. Okay. That it is actually more harm. Okay, I agree. All right. And because why? The cost becomes more expensive. Employers will then fire them and they lose their jobs. And when they lose their jobs, there is no income. They will struggle to support themselves, and there is a fall in standard of living. That's it. Don't have to go to so many things. The link is minimum wage laws do more harm because standard of living decreases as there is no more jobs. That is the idea. That is the link. Okay. However, you can flip and you can say that I disagree. I disagree because it does show that the law is actually quite decent. The law is actually quite good. And there will be workers who will now enjoy more than one job and they're able to sustain their financial expenses better. Can you see the link is so short? This will bring less worry to workers and they will enjoy a better quality of life. So again, the good part here is about increasing standard of living, increasing quality of life. Okay, all right. Now, as you look at all the sources, for example, it is very specific, okay? And you can go all the way to the back and you can actually take a look at the different yes and no. Okay, I'm just going to go through the different yes and no, the harm and benefits. Okay, so I did it in this one, I sort of like compact. These are all links, These are all links, So if you say that minimum wage laws do more harm than good, so let's take a look at the more harm than good. Okay, so how does it create harm? Because we're talking about economics, we're talking about standard of living, we're talking about wage. So focus that ideas there. We are talking at the end of the day about wage, and wage is all about the money. Agree? All right. So what is it, or how does it lead to harm? Because lower income group can lose their jobs. So when they lose their jobs, standard of living decrease. And when standard of living decrease, quality of life decrease. That's it. That is your link. Business may be affected, all right, because it is now they need to sustain or they need to pay people with higher wages. And some businesses, especially what kind of businesses? Small businesses, right? They cannot afford. And when they cannot afford, they close down. And when they close down, they have to get rid of these people that they employed who are on minimum wage. So it leads to even, okay, use this kind of words. It leads to a spiral effect. Write it down somewhere. It leads to a spiral effect. All right, because it means it becomes worse and worse and worse. Okay. Now, next is how does it harm? Because there will be exploitation of workers, right, by employers in terms of higher expectations and requirements as a result of higher pay. Okay, which means that um, when a company hires a worker, okay, with minimum wage, the idea here is when a company hires a worker based on minimum wage, what the idea is, well, I pay you this much, right? Okay, I pay you this much, right? So you must do this amount of job. You must do this amount of job. So exploitation, no? All right, so this is one of the harm that the minimum wage law can do. And the other one is Who pays for all this? It is basically the companies. But if the companies still cannot provide that minimum wage, right? Okay. A lot of the time, the people, the taxpayers actually must level up. Okay. And the reason is if the minimum wage laws were not implemented, okay, a lot of the other sectors, okay, these are other sectors, because remember we talk about expense, we talk about the country's budget, it is limited. If I spend so much money into leveling up people who the minimum wage is not enough, right? I will have to then sustain and subsidize, just like we have our workers fare, that kind of thing, right? So when we spend money on workers fare, other aspects of the industry, other aspects of the development of the country gets affected. Okay, we cannot spend so much money just on workers that we forget other aspects. All right. Now, how about A is good? It is actually very good. That minimum wage laws actually is more good than harm. So what is the benefits of it? Okay, the benefits is improved standard of living lah. All right, you get more pay, what? More money, increase in money. Okay, better quality of life, because when you have more money, you don't worry so much about, okay, have I paid the bills, this kind of thing. The higher end or the higher goal is, of course, to eliminate poverty, correct? And businesses can afford to pay higher wage to their workers. And when businesses pay the workers a higher wage, is a win-win situation. Why? Because look at point number 5. Point number 5 is they have a higher spending capacity. Higher spending capacity means they can spend a little bit more. When they spend a little bit more, it goes back to the businesses. So I wouldn't say that the minimum wage law is all bad. I wouldn't say that the minimum wage law is all good. It depends on whose perspective. It depends on who is it. So as you're doing your revision, all right, what you do is identify which of the source actually says what. Okay, identify that aspect. I've already put the yes and no. So all these are actually the links. Okay, so go. I mean, this student tonight or tomorrow, okay, go and read this up. However, I want to show you this bonus. Okay, I want to go and talk about bonus. And I also want to show you what the Marcus report actually says. Candidates should be encouraged to attempt the bonus route. What does this mean? Must try. Considering the opportunities presented in the case study and multiple ways of them to do so. Okay, so they really, really want you to try the bonus because it is a good differentiating factor. All right. Remember, you just do one yes, one no, and one source that questions the reliability, or if you're able to do 2 yes, 2 no, and then after that you do a conclusion, okay? Or if you have cross-reference contextual knowledge, try. I think given that it is an O level, we should just try it, and go all out. I think that is the one that's important. So what are the 3 ways of bonuses? Sufficient, okay, reliability, contextual knowledge. Okay, so for this were the few things that was actually addressed. A lot of them said that about source B. Source B is actually unreliable. If you remember source B, this is source B, the Irish guy. Okay, he is just one person, one worker. So because of that, we may not be able to rely on him. Okay, he is perhaps there is vested interest. Okay, this is always a very important word to use. Vested interest means there is a certain agenda, a certain motive. Okay, the other thing is, if you're able to use this, of course, this is, to me, it's one of the hardest, because you need to have contextual knowledge. Cannot be anyhow knowledge. It's really contextual knowledge. It is only accepted if the source has been awarded marks for good explanation. So remember the source A about what is happening in America. In Korea, there's a minimum wage law. It's $10 per hour. With this, part-time students are able to take up just one job to sustain their expenses. And this ensures a work-life harmony and improves their standard of living. So this is done after a source and you want to refute it, or if you want to support it based on your contextual knowledge. Okay, so these are things that you must try. Okay, the other thing is the balance conclusion, which is here. I'm going to highlight in pink. Okay, candidates' attempts at balanced conclusion usually focuses on the challenges in resolving the competing needs. The candidate's opinion that there is no one good or effective decision. So I love balanced conclusion. Balanced conclusion is like, it's a yes and no. Okay, the only thing that you should remember that when you do bonus for balanced conclusion is you need to always refer back to the source. Other candidates acknowledge that trade-offs can be avoided by implementing minimum wage laws and suggest that careful weighing of short-term and long-term benefit. So not so easy for this particular 2020 paper, but a balanced conclusion is interesting because what it gives is it gives a narrative that actually is a yes and no. It's both parts, both sides of it. And it's quite easy to do. The only cons is that you write balanced conclusion at the end of all your sources. Okay, so that is the one thing that you need to be careful about. Okay, so as you are going through this and the PDF version, recap, revise the skills. I would say among all the O-level papers, this as well as the 2017, the HASTE, and the globalization, the 2018 one, is one of the so-called harder or a bit more demanding, but nevertheless, I think you guys could do it. Okay, I am going to stop share for a while and I am going to